I'm Julia Emerson, 33 years old, and I never imagined my own father would ask me to leave his birthday party because I didn't look rich enough. I wore my navy dress, the one I always saved for important events, and smiled as I handed him the gift I'd spent weeks picking out. He looked at me like I was a stranger, then whispered that my outfit wasn't suitable for the guests they were trying to impress. Behind him, my stepmother Lynn stood watching, lips tight with satisfaction. "We can have dinner just us next week," Dad offered while guiding me toward the door. He didn't know that less than a week later I'd be sitting across from his company's CEO in a boardroom. He never thought I belonged in. He didn't know I'd be handed the keys to everything he thought I couldn't manage. He just knew I didn't fit the image he wanted that night. Before I tell you the rest, drop a comment to let me know where you're listening from, and hit that like button if you've ever been told you weren't enough by someone who should have been in your corner. Growing up, it was just Dad and me after Mom passed away from ovarian cancer. When I was 9, he did his best to hold things together. He ran a small metalworks business out of the garage back then, and still managed to make it to every school play and parent-teacher meeting. He'd tell me bedtime stories about how he and Mom met in college. Both working long shifts to stay afloat, he'd say. I had her steadiness and her stubborn streak. He used to call me his girl, said we were a team. Things changed when I was 14. Dad met Lynn at a Chamber of Commerce event. She wore polished heels and spoke in polished phrases. She had 2 kids from a previous marriage. Sierra was already driving and Chase wasn't far behind. Within a year, we moved from our modest ranch house into a 5-bedroom colonial in the gated part of town. Lynn said it was necessary for networking and branding. Dad stopped wearing his old work boots and started talking about image and impressions. I stopped being his girl and started being an afterthought in family photos, where I stood off to the side if I was in them at all. Report cards got less praise. Birthday dinners turned into quiet nights, while the rest of them were out at charity galas or lacrosse games. Sierra's B- in social studies came with flowers and applause. My national merit finalist letter got a distracted nod. Lynn liked to say Sierra had people skills, and if I spent too long with books, she'd raise an eyebrow and say, "Not everything can be solved with grades, Julia." By the time I was a senior in high school, Dad didn't come to my academic banquet. Lynn said he was exhausted and that I should be more understanding. He somehow had energy to coach Chase's summer baseball league, though I stopped asking. I stopped expecting. When it came time to choose colleges, I told him I wanted to major in business and maybe take over the company one day. He laughed in that way. That's half kind and half dismissive. "Business is tough, sweetheart. Maybe think about teaching or something flexible for when you have kids." Lynn added that the office was no place for sensitive types. That night, I called my grandfather William. He drove over the next morning and said he and Grandma had opened a savings bond for me years ago. He told me to apply wherever I wanted. "You're built for more than they can see," he said. I went to a state university with a strong business program, graduated with honors. My family came to the ceremony, but left before the dean's reception because Sierra had a dance showcase across town. I got a quick hug from Dad and a passing comment about how everyone's so proud. I didn't mention the job offer I had, waiting at Pinnacle Industries, didn't mention the scholarship I'd won for top project in strategic planning. They didn't ask. 5 years passed. I worked my way up from assistant to analyst to manager at holiday dinners. I spoke vaguely about my work. Dad would talk about Chase's new car or Sierra's boutique job. Once Lynn joked that I must still be answering phones because you haven't mentioned a promotion. I smiled and passed the cranberry sauce. Then the envelope came thick cream paper embossed in gold, an invitation to Dad's 62nd birthday party at the most exclusive country club in the city. I RSVP'd. Yes, maybe this time would be different. Maybe. Turning 62 had made him think about legacy, about family, about me. It wasn't until the night before the party that Lynn called to check in on what I was wearing when I told her navy blue. She said, "Oh, Julia, for evening you might consider something more suitable." She mentioned that a few gentlemen from Pinnacle Industries would be attending important people. She said, "I said I'd see them there." I didn't tell her I already knew. Didn't tell her those men were in meetings with our top executives, that they were reviewing Dad's company, that I'd seen the file marked confidential on my supervisor's desk. I just pressed my dress set aside. the gift I'd picked out for Dad, and decided I'd go anyway the next evening. I pulled into the Oakmont parking circle. I handed my car to the valet and walked toward the marble entrance. The sky was that dusky pink that only shows up right before autumn takes over. I adjusted the pearl necklace my mother had left me. The foyer glowed with soft chandeliers and murmurs of old money. I spotted my father standing near the fireplace with a glass in hand. For a second he looked just like I remembered, tired maybe, but proud. He smiled when he saw me. Then Lynn walked up behind him and everything changed. Dad stepped back the moment Lynn reached his side. Her eyes slid from my face to the hem of my dress and lingered there. She leaned close to him, her hand barely touching his elbow. I couldn't hear what she said, but his expression tightened. He looked over my shoulder, then back at me. "Julia," he said, his voice dropping. "Can we talk over here for a second?" I followed him a few steps into a quiet hallway that opened toward the coat check. The lights were dimmer there, muted sconces casting soft shadows across the pale wallpaper. Lynn didn't follow, but she stayed close enough to see us. Dad didn't look me in the eye when he spoke. "There's been a slight change in plans, something with the venue and the number of guests. It's complicated." I waited. He fidgeted with the corner of his cufflink. "There are fire codes, and with some important folks from Pinnacle here tonight." He trailed off, glancing back toward the main ballroom. "It might be better if we reschedule something more private. Just you and me." Another night. I felt my jaw tighten. "Are you asking me to leave?" "It's not personal, honey. It's just your dress and the people in attendance." Lynn thought, well, we both thought it might not present the image we're aiming for tonight. I stood still, the sound of ice clinking and cocktail glasses drifting in from the next room. "You think I look poor?" I said softly. He rubbed the back of his neck. "It's not that. It's just appearances matter to these people. We don't want to give them the wrong impression." "Of what?" I asked. "That you have a daughter who wears department store dresses." His mouth pressed into a thin line. "Let's just not make this harder." From behind him, I could see Sierra gliding past the entrance in a dress that shimmered gold under the chandeliers. Chase followed behind her in a dark tux with a wide satin lapel. He caught my eye and gave a slow grin before disappearing into the crowd. "I'm your daughter," I said. "You invited me. We'll make time soon. I promise." There was movement to my right. A man in a black blazer stepped into the hallway. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, glancing between us. Dad cleared his throat. "Yes, my daughter was just leaving. I know where the door is," I said. The man nodded once and stepped aside. I held out the small wrapped box I had brought. "This was your gift," I said. Dad took it slowly. "I doubt there's anything inside that means more than what you've just given up," I added. I walked out through the main doors, passing clusters of guests laughing near the bar. I kept my chin level as I passed the valet stand. Just as I reached the drive, a sleek black car pulled up. The driver opened the door, and a tall man stepped out in a charcoal gray suit. It was Franklin Rhodes, the CEO of Pinnacle Industries. I turned away before he could see me. On the ride home, the city lights blurred through the windshield. I kept seeing my father's face when I handed him the gift, how his smile had vanished the moment Lynn leaned in. At a red light, I looked down at my lap, where my fingers still trembled slightly. The navy dress was perfectly fine, but it hadn't been enough for him. That night I didn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying not to think about the way my father's voice had changed, the way he wouldn't look at me. Morning brought gray skies and steady rain tapping against the windows like a slow metronome. It wasn't until nearly noon that my phone rang. "Grandpa William." I heard what happened, he said, skipping any greeting. "You were there, I saw you come in. I was trying to catch up to you before you left, but I missed you." Harold should be ashamed of himself. I sat up, wrapping the blanket around my shoulders. Lynn did most of the talking. "She always does," he muttered. There was a pause, and then his tone changed. "After you left, I had a word with Franklin Rhodes." My breath caught. "You what?" "We go back a ways. I told him you worked at Pinnacle. He didn't know that. Didn't know you were Harold's daughter either." "Grandpa." He was impressed. "Said your name had crossed his desk more than once for your performance. I think you'll be hearing from him soon." As if on cue, my phone chimed with a new message. "It's from his assistant," I said, opening the email. "He wants to meet tomorrow morning." "Don't be nervous," Grandpa said. "You've earned it. Your father made a fool of himself, but this could turn out to be something." The call ended, and I sat in silence for a while rereading the email. Then I got up, made a pot of coffee, and pulled my laptop out. If tomorrow's meeting was what I suspected, I needed to be prepared. I reviewed internal files, memorized the structure of the Collins Company, and made a quiet list of potential merger conflicts. I didn't know what the CEO wanted to discuss, but I would walk in ready. Monday morning, I wore a dark gray suit with a crisp blouse and my mother's pearls. My hair was pulled back neatly, my shoes polished. I arrived an hour early. At 9 sharp, I was escorted up to the executive floor where the ceilings were higher and the carpets thicker. I'd only been there once before for a quarterly update. Franklin Rhodes met me at the door to his corner office. He shook my hand with the warm grip and gestured for me to sit. 3 others were already in the room: my department director, a senior VP, and a man I didn't recognize but guessed was from the acquisitions team. Franklin got right to the point. "Your grandfather spoke very highly of you," he said. "I did some checking. Your record here speaks for itself." I nodded. He slid a folder across the desk. "We've been reviewing Collins Manufacturing for several months. Due diligence is complete. The acquisition is moving forward." I glanced at the folder but didn't open it. "We'd like you to oversee the transition." I looked up. "You want me to manage the acquisition of my father's company?" "That's right." He leaned back in his chair. "You know the business, you know our standards, and you have a connection to the company that could prove useful if you're willing." I thought of Dad's voice at the party, how he said my dress made me look too poor, how he didn't even know where I worked. I met Franklin's eyes. "Yes, I'm willing." He smiled, then added, "Your new title will be Transition Director. Compensation and responsibilities are in that folder. The announcement goes out next Monday." I nodded once. "And Julia," he said as I stood, "your grandfather mentioned a certain navy dress. Might be a good choice for the announcement." I didn't answer, but a small smile found its way to my face as I stepped out into the hallway. The week leading up to the announcement moved fast. Every day brought a new file to review, a new chart to study, a new decision to prepare for. I sat through meetings with legal, finance, HR, and operations, piecing together the real condition of Collins Manufacturing. What I saw confirmed what I'd quietly suspected. The numbers had started slipping the same year Lynn and her children joined the company. Not dramatically at first, but the pattern was clear. Salaries climbed, expenses bloated, revenue stayed flat. Nothing justified the spending, especially not the sudden additions to the executive team. The financial reports listed clothing allowances, country club dues, monthly client development dinners with no records of actual clients. 3 of the top salaried roles had overlapping responsibilities, and none of them had performance reviews on file. I didn't need names to know who held those titles. By Friday, I had a plan. I created an evaluation framework that would apply to every employee: factory workers, supervisors, senior staff, and executives. No exceptions. Each role would be measured by job description output and contribution to the company's goals. Whether someone had been there 2 years or 20, they would be evaluated the same way. I chose a temporary office on site, but made sure not to take over anyone's space. I wanted to be visible, but not intrusive. Just a steady presence. A lot of folks weren't sure what to make of me yet. I introduced myself, simply listened more than I talked, and made sure the team knew I was there to understand before making changes. That weekend I didn't hear from Dad. Not a text, not a call. I wasn't surprised. What had happened at the party hadn't just embarrassed him, it had exposed things he'd spent years trying to pretend weren't real. Monday morning arrived sunny and cold. I wore the navy dress. Same one. I added a blazer this time and a smooth knot at the back of my hair. The pearl necklace sat just under the collar. Everything fit right. Franklin Rhodes met me in the parking lot along with Mark Deason from Acquisitions and 2 members of the legal team. We walked in together through the side entrance, passing familiar machinery and quiet conversations on the factory floor. The executives had been told there would be a major update and to meet in the main conference room by 9. When we walked in, they were all seated: Dad at the head of the table, Lynn on his right, Sierra beside her, Chase at the end. The other seats were filled with men I remembered from my childhood, people who had known me when I still rode my bike through the warehouse hallways. Dad blinked when he saw me. His posture straightened, but he didn't speak. Lynn's expression didn't change. Sierra's mouth opened slightly, and Chase sat up a little too quickly. Before anyone could say a word, Franklin stepped forward. "Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming." He paused, then smiled politely. Effective immediately, Pinnacle Industries has completed its acquisition of Collins Manufacturing. The agreement was finalized last Friday. Murmurs rippled around the table. Lynn went stiff. Chase glanced down. Dad's hands folded tightly in his lap. Franklin continued, "This facility will now operate as a wholly owned division of Pinnacle Custom Manufacturing. There will be a 90-day integration period. We'll be evaluating all processes and personnel to determine what best serves the business going forward." Dad finally stood. "This wasn't finalized," he said. "We were still in talks. Your CFO signed the final documents with approval from the board," Franklin replied gently. "All appropriate procedures were followed." Franklin then turned to me. "I'd like to introduce Julia Emerson, who will serve as transition director. She'll lead the integration process." The room went still. Lynn's lips parted as if to speak, but nothing came out. Sierra looked away. Chase pressed a hand against his knee, like he was bracing for a fall. Dad didn't sit down. "My daughter," he asked. "You put my daughter in charge of my company." Franklin didn't flinch. "Your former company. Julia has been with Pinnacle for 5 years and has earned every promotion. She was chosen for this role based on performance, not family ties." I stepped forward and nodded once. "Over the next several weeks, I'll be meeting with each department to better understand your workflows, challenges, and strengths," I said. "Everyone will be evaluated based on objective criteria. I want this to be a fair and productive transition for the entire team." Lynn recovered her voice first. "This is outrageous," she said. "There's no way this will stand. Harold—" "It's not up to Harold," Franklin said firmly. The board made its decision. Dad looked at me then. Not angry, not yet. Just confused, like he was trying to reconcile 2 images in his head and they weren't lining up. As the meeting ended, people filtered out in quiet knots. I stayed behind to answer questions from a few of the senior engineers and line supervisors. Lynn lingered near the door, arms crossed. "We need to talk," she said, her smile tight. "Privately." I met her gaze evenly. "I'd be happy to schedule something through my assistant," I replied. Her mouth flattened. "Don't be ridiculous. We're family. At work I said we're colleagues, and all colleagues follow the same protocols." Her smile dropped. "You think you're clever, using this job to get back at us for a misunderstanding?" I kept my tone calm. The acquisition was already underway. "My role is to manage the transition fairly." She leaned in just enough that only I could hear. "Harold won't let this stand." I didn't reply. She turned and left. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Dad standing by the far window watching. That night I reviewed files in the temporary office. I opened each department binder one at a time, checking for role descriptions, project outcomes, and performance reviews. Chase's title read Strategic Investment Officer. His salary was 3 times higher than the industry standard for someone with his credentials, and there was no documented investment performance in his file. Sierra was listed as Creative Brand Director. No marketing plans, no campaigns, no evidence of deliverables. Lynn was Executive VP of Public Relations. Her only listed accomplishment was arranging a yearly holiday party. Each folder felt heavier than the last. By the end of the night, I closed my laptop and leaned back in the chair. There was no question what needed to happen, but the question of how they'd respond still hung in the air. The weeks that followed were full. Every morning started with meetings, walkthroughs, or quiet conversations on the shop floor. I kept my door open. I made sure people saw that I listened. The evaluations moved ahead as planned. Department leads submitted reports. Line managers confirmed hours and responsibilities. My assistant helped gather supporting data, but I read every file myself. Some staff avoided eye contact in the hallways. Others sought me out, offering insights questions, or sometimes just a nervous joke. Most weren't sure what the changes would bring. They just wanted to be treated fairly. I hadn't spoken directly to Dad since the day of the announcement. In meetings, he sat quietly and contributed only when asked. His answers were brief but accurate. If anything, he seemed relieved not to carry the full weight of the business anymore. Chase, on the other hand, wasn't quiet. By the end of the second week, he'd begun making comments around the office that I had been handed this role, that Grandpa had pulled strings, that the new management didn't understand legacy operations. One of the analysts overheard him telling someone I'd never last through the transition period. I let it sit for a day before scheduling a meeting. He showed up late, slouched in his chair, and rolled a pen between his fingers while I went over the performance expectations. I laid out the same data review criteria everyone else was receiving. Same charts, same metrics, nothing more, nothing less. When I asked about the missing documentation for his department's returns, he said the files were somewhere on the old system. I gave him a deadline to retrieve them and walked him out. 3 days later, Sierra submitted a formal complaint. She claimed that my evaluation process was targeted and retaliatory. She attached a 4-line summary of her brand initiatives, 2 photos of product displays, and a testimonial from a boutique client she hadn't worked with in over a year. HR reviewed her file and mine. After a short inquiry, they dismissed the complaint and noted that all documentation had followed Pinnacle's standard transition protocol. Sierra didn't speak to me again. I didn't hear from Lynn directly, but I noticed her name start appearing less frequently on the call calendar. Her email responses came shorter, more clipped. Someone forwarded me an invitation she sent for a charity luncheon. No one from Collins Manufacturing had been included. I kept my focus on the work. By the 3rd week, the evaluations were nearly complete. I knew what needed to happen, and I had the documentation to support it. I stayed late on Thursday reviewing final notes. Around 8:30, I heard a soft knock at the door. Dad stood in the hallway holding 2 paper cups. "I figured you were still here," he said. "Brought you some coffee." I nodded and moved some folders to make room. He sat down across from me and looked around the room. I used to think this company would pass down to someone in the family, someone who'd understand it. I waited. "I didn't think that person would be you," he said, not unkindly. "That's my fault." I let the quiet hold a beat before answering. "You never asked what I was building." He took a sip of coffee. "No, I didn't." We sat like that for a while. The office was still, just the low hum of lights and the sound of papers shifting as I reached for another file. "You've handled this better than I expected," he said. "Better than I could have, honestly." I looked at him. He seemed tired, the kind of tired that sits deep behind the eyes. "Did you know," I asked, "what Chase and Sierra were being paid?" He gave a slight nod. "I signed the contracts and the country club memberships." He hesitated, then nodded again. "It added up," I said. "I thought it would help them feel like part of the business," he replied. "Lynn said it would make them loyal. And did it?" He didn't answer right away, just stared at the floor. "I wanted the company to look successful," he said quietly, "even when it wasn't." We sat there a little longer. Then he stood up. "What happens next?" he asked. "The evaluations are nearly complete," I said. "The board will review the recommendations next week." He nodded. "I'll cooperate." As he reached the door, he paused. "I talked to Franklin last week. He said you've kept things professional." I nodded. "Your mother would have done the same," he said. Then he stepped out into the hallway. I closed the last file and turned off the desk lamp. The building was quiet by the time I reached my car. 3 days after Dad left my office, I got a call from Lynn. She didn't leave a message, just her number blinking on the screen followed by a text. "Family dinner, tomorrow night at 7. Harold insists you come." It was the first time she'd reached out directly since the transition began. No mention of the restructuring, no apology, no explanation, just a dinner. I texted back a short confirmation. The next evening, I parked outside the same house I'd spent my teenage years in. The lights were on the driveway full. Chase's BMW sat crooked near the hedge, one tire brushing against the grass. I stepped out of the car and took a breath. Lynn opened the door wearing a pale silk blouse and too much perfume. She gave a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Right on time," she said. The house smelled like rosemary chicken and lemon candles. The dining room table was fully set. Linen napkins polished silver tall glasses of wine already poured. Sierra and Chase stood by the fireplace mid-conversation. They both glanced up when I entered. Neither said hello. Dad came from the hallway, hands in his pockets. He gave me a quick nod. "Glad you're here," he said. "Just water, thanks," I replied when Lynn offered a drink. "Early morning." She clapped once. "Let's eat, shall we?" We sat in our usual places, me across from Sierra Dad at the head. Lynn had set the table with her best china. The centerpiece was oversized and fragrant. As we passed plates around and made small talk about weather and local news, no one mentioned the company. No one said the word Pinnacle. It wasn't until dessert that Lynn began. "So, Julia," she said sweetly, "Harold tells me you've been working hard on the transition. Quite a responsibility, I imagine." I nodded once. "I imagine it must be complicated having to evaluate your own family members." She gave a short sigh. "Such a conflict of interest. I mentioned that to Franklin when we had lunch last week." Her fork slid across the edge of her plate with just enough sound to break the quiet. "I've discussed that with the board," I said. "Every recommendation is reviewed by a committee." Chase leaned forward. "Come on, Julia. Let's be honest. This whole thing's about payback. You've been holding a grudge for years." I didn't answer him. "You never liked us," Sierra added. "Now you've got a title and you're using it to make us look bad." Dad cleared his throat, but I kept my voice steady. "Your performance reviews are based on documented outcomes," I said. "Same as everyone else. You only got this role because of Grandpa Chase said. Everyone knows it." Dad set his fork down. "That's enough," he said. Heather didn't stop. "It's true. You've been jealous of us for years. And now you're in charge." "You think this is about jealousy?" I asked. "It's about years of financial records that don't add up. It's about a company that's been paying inflated salaries for roles that have no output." Lynn leaned forward. "How dare you? You have no idea what I've done for this family, for this company. Your expense account last year exceeded the entire marketing budget," I said. "That's not a judgment. That's a fact." Dad opened his mouth to speak, but I held up a hand. "No, Dad. Let me finish. I've sat in silence for years. I've watched Chase get applauded for half-finished projects and Sierra get handed roles she didn't train for, and all while being told I wasn't a good fit for business." Chase pushed back his chair. "This is ridiculous. It's overdue," I said. Lynn's voice turned cold. "You've always been a problem, since the day I met you. Always watching, always trying to prove something." I stayed quiet. "I protected Harold from you," she said. "He couldn't see what you were doing, but I did. You were trying to pull him back into that small life he had before." Dad looked over his expression unreadable. "Harold," she said, turning toward him, "tell her she's wrong." He didn't. "I've been reviewing the reports," he said. "She's not wrong." Sierra looked stunned. "You're taking her side." "I'm looking at the numbers," he said quietly. "And I've seen what she's done these past few weeks." Chase crossed his arms. "So what happens now?" "We get fired." "No," I said. "You're being offered reassigned roles based on qualifications and performance. If you accept them, you'll stay on. If not, that's your choice. You're doing this to get back at us," Lynn said. "For the party, for everything. I'm doing this for the company," I said. The party was just the final piece of the pattern. Dad stood. "This dinner's over," he said. Lynn looked at him sharply. "You're letting her destroy everything we built." "I'm admitting that I let things get out of hand," he replied. "That I let the wrong people make the decisions." I stood, reached for my purse. "Thank you for dinner," I said. As I walked toward the door, Dad followed. He waited until we were outside before speaking. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm not doing this to hurt you," I replied. "I know," he said. We stood in the quiet. The porch light above us hummed. "What happens to Lynn's role?" he asked. "The VP title is being eliminated," I said. "There's no operational need for it." He nodded. I figured, her marriage won't survive this. I didn't say anything. He exhaled slowly. Maybe it's time I stopped pretending. He opened the door and stepped back inside. I got in my car, turned the engine, and drove away without looking back. By the end of the 8th week, the new structure for Collins Manufacturing was nearly complete. The final evaluations had been presented to the board, the reassigned roles approved, and a timeline for implementation finalized. It had been steady work, no shortcuts, no assumptions. Just the numbers, the documents, and the facts. Dad had settled into a new rhythm. He'd been meeting regularly with Pinnacle's product innovation team and seemed at ease in that space. His days on the factory floor grew longer, his calendar lighter. For the first time in years, he wasn't responsible for everything, and that seemed to suit him. Chase didn't handle the changes as well. He rejected the reassigned title outright, left the building that afternoon without saying goodbye to anyone. 3 weeks later, I heard through HR that he'd tried applying at a local firm and was turned away after the first interview. A few days after that, he called and asked to reconsider the position. He now worked under a senior analyst who didn't tolerate shortcuts and who'd already flagged several of Chase's reports for revision. Sierra walked away without a word. The role she was offered, junior marketing associate, was below the title she had worn, but it matched her qualifications. She never responded to the offer. Last I heard, she was working at a boutique downtown and posting curated photos from behind the cash wrap. Lynn was the most difficult. After her role was formally dissolved, she began contacting vendors and clients she had known through the company. A few passed along emails. One included a printed message claiming she had been pushed out by a vindictive transition director with a personal agenda. Legal had to step in. A formal cease and desist was issued the following week. After that, the noise died down. But it wasn't just the restructuring that was changing things. Dad moved out of the house in early spring. He didn't say much about it. Just let me know during a Friday morning meeting that he'd found a small condo a few miles from the plant. He said it was quieter, more manageable. When I asked about Lynn, he said the divorce paperwork had been filed. Grandpa William had been following everything closely. We still met for coffee every Sunday, and he never asked for details, but I could tell he knew more than I said. He'd raise an eyebrow at a name or offer a short nod when I mentioned a finalized round of promotions. Then one Thursday afternoon, while reviewing schedules for the second quarter, my phone buzzed. It was Dad. I answered, expecting a question about material orders or vendor terms. "It's your grandfather," he said quietly. "The hospital just called. I was already on my feet. Is he?" "They think it was a heart attack," he said. "They're stabilizing him now. I'm heading over." I was parked outside the hospital 20 minutes later. Dad met me at the front doors, his tie loose at the collar. He said they'd moved Grandpa to a monitored room and that the prognosis looked manageable, but he'd need to stay a few days, change in diet, new medications, more rest. I looked past Dad and saw Lynn in the waiting room. She stood when she saw me. Her blouse was wrinkled, her hair pulled back too tightly. She looked smaller somehow, less like the woman who had answered the door to a mansion, and more like someone waiting on news she couldn't control. "What are you doing here?" Dad asked. "Your father was my father-in-law for 7 years," she said. "I came when I heard." The hallway doors opened. A nurse called for family. Dad and I stepped forward. The nurse waved us back. "One at a time," she said. "Maybe 2 if it's brief." Dad turned to me. "You go first." Grandpa was propped up in bed, eyes closed, but alert. He opened them when I entered and gave me a half smile. "There she is," he said. "The executive." I sat beside him and took his hand. "You scared us," he shrugged. "Cholesterol caught up to me. Don't ever skip your checkups." I nodded. The monitors beeped quietly behind us. "She came," I said after a pause. "Lynn?" I nodded again. He gave a short laugh, probably checking if she's still in the will. "Grandpa." "Oh, don't be shocked," he said. "You know it's true." He shifted slightly under the blankets. "She's not all bad," he added. "Just aimed herself at the wrong things." I stayed for a few more minutes before heading back to the waiting room. Dad and Lynn were sitting side by side, not touching, not speaking. "He's asking for both of you," I said. They stood, glanced at each other, and walked toward the doors together. I waited in the same chair Lynn had been sitting in. I looked around the waiting room. A few other families sat hunched over magazines or phones or just their own quiet thoughts. They came back 15 minutes later. Neither said much. Dad looked over at me. "He wants everyone at his 95th birthday. No exceptions. And no drama. That sounds like him." He also told me, Lynn said slowly, that I never fooled him. I didn't say anything. He said I should have built something of my own instead of trying to rebuild his. She looked down at her hands. Her nails were chipped. "He's not wrong," she added. That night I drove home slowly. The roads were quiet. The air had cooled just enough to make the windows fog at the corners. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car a little longer, thinking about what it meant to build something that could last. Grandpa's 95th birthday came on a Saturday in early May. Warm air, soft light through the windows, and the kind of quiet you only get after a long winter finally lets go. We gathered in the back room of his favorite restaurant, just family and a few close friends. Dad arrived first. He was alone, dressed simply, looking more at ease than I'd seen him in years. His hair had gone mostly gray, and there were new lines around his eyes, but he stood straighter. Not out of pride, more like clarity. Chase walked in next. He wore a pressed shirt and carried himself with quiet restraint. A few months in his new role had changed him. He nodded at me from across the room but didn't speak. Sierra came late. She gave Grandpa a kiss on the cheek and joined a corner table, thumbing her phone between bites of bread. I didn't expect more. Lynn arrived last. She wore a tailored blazer, carried a wrapped gift, and made polite conversation with everyone except Dad. She kept her distance, still smiling, still poised, but I could see the shift. Less polished perfection, more practiced composure. Grandpa sat at the head of the table, his favorite dessert in front of him, a tiny flame flickering above the frosting. He lifted his glass of sparkling cider and looked around the room. To family, he said, his voice steady. Not just the one you're born into, but the one you choose day by day through your actions and your integrity. His eyes met mine for a moment. I raised my glass in return. After the meal, Dad and I walked Grandpa to his car. He moved slowly but refused help. When we reached the sidewalk, he paused and looked back at the restaurant. "What a mess we made," Dad said, watching, as the others filtered out in different directions. Grandpa gave a quiet laugh. "All because we forgot what matters." Dad turned to me. Substance over appearance, truth over pretense, real work over titles. I nodded once. It stayed with me. He smiled at that. 6 months later, we held a celebration at the plant to mark the completion of the pinnacle integration. No fanfare, just a catered lunch, some recognition plaques, and a quiet speech from the leadership team. Production numbers were up, expenses were down. The facility had met its goals 2 quarters in a row. As regional director, I gave the opening remarks. I kept it brief, thanked the teams, outlined our next benchmarks, and introduced a few of the new team leads. When I finished, I invited Dad up to speak. He stepped forward slowly, wearing his Collins Manufacturing badge, clipped to a simple jacket. The room quieted. "Many of you have known me for a long time," he said. "You saw this company grow from a small shop to a larger operation. You also saw it nearly fall apart." He looked down for a moment, then back at the group. "I made mistakes. I let myself get distracted by things that don't build anything. But thanks to a lot of hard work, and one person in particular, this company got a second chance." He gestured toward me. "She reminded me of what this place was meant to be, and who I used to be before I forgot." Applause followed. I stepped aside as people clapped, some nodding, quietly, others exchanging glances that said more than words could. Afterward, as the employees returned to their stations and the lunch trays were cleared, Dad approached me near the back hallway. "I meant what I said," he told me. Every word. I nodded. He looked around the room, then back at me. "You're the legacy now," he said. And for the first time in a long time, that didn't feel like a burden. It felt like something earned. 6 months passed, and with each turn of the calendar, life settled into something sturdier, quieter. Collins Manufacturing was no longer the company I'd grown up around, and that was a good thing. It was stronger now, leaner, honest, humming with purpose instead of pretense. Dad visited the plant most days, helping the engineers test new designs or walking the floor with a notepad in his hand. We'd meet for lunch sometimes at the little cafe near his condo, talking more about new ideas than old regrets. Chase adjusted to his new role with fewer complaints, learning the work one project at a time. Sierra drifted, but her visits for family occasions grew less tense as the months went by. Lynn kept her distance, sending a card for Grandpa's birthday and nothing more. Grandpa William recovered well, stubborn as ever, leading the toast at Thanksgiving with his familiar, "To family, the one you earn." The air at the factory changed too. I'd walk the halls and see faces that had survived the upheaval, older machinists training younger hands. Line leads building new routines, laughter echoing from the break room. There was still hard work, still the pressure of numbers and deadlines, but something softer had settled in. People met my eyes. They nodded when I passed. The old heaviness had lifted. One afternoon, Dad stopped by my office. He lingered in the doorway for a moment, then sat across from me. "I thought I was building a legacy," he said quietly, "but I see now it's not about the name on the door. It's about the people who stay, the ones who give their best no matter who gets the credit." I listened, and in that moment, all the words I'd waited to hear as a child finally found their way home. If there's anything this journey taught me, it's that justice isn't always about winning or getting back what was lost. Sometimes it's about standing your ground, making the right choice when it matters, and finding the courage to start again. The people who matter, the ones who lift you up, who see you clearly, may not always be the family you were born with, but they're the family you build one honest day at a time. If this story reached you, I hope you'll share your own or hold it close for a moment. And if you ever find yourself standing outside a door that should have been open, remember your worth isn't measured by the welcome you receive, but by the life you choose to build next. Thank you for listening.